Mm. Hey, Therese.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hey, good to see you all.
Good to see you. Let me see. Hi. You're okay. And here's your.
I think I could safely dispense with the mask in here. I don't think I'll be anywhere near any of you.
I think you can.
And I can talk a little easier without the mask. Is everyone who is supposed to be here on Zoom here? Okay, welcome to the Zoom participants. Welcome to the in-person participants. We'll be doing a little bit of a survey of American Catholicism. And rather than doing it strictly chronologically, I'm doing it thematically. So the first is more or less chronological. We'll be talking about the colonial period in the United States. Next week, we'll be asking the vexing question, can one be both American and Catholic? And what does that mean? The third presentation will be on the experience of immigrants. The fourth presentation, the experience of the Catholic Church with indigenous peoples and with Black people in the United States. And the fifth and final one is the creation of a Catholic subculture, sometimes dismissively referred to as the Catholic ghetto, which, given the white hair of many of the people in the room here, and I suspect that are also there, grew up in this. Then we'll talk about its dissolution and what it looks like today. So those are our 5 themes. Okay? So we'll start with Spain. Now, it's important to understand the background of Spain. Spain is the first and only country in Europe to have reformed the Catholic Church before the Council of Trent. Already in the year 1478, at the Synod of Seville, the Spanish Church underwent its own internal purification process, not guided by the papacy. This led to what has been called the spiritual fervor of the Spanish Golden Age. Just think about it. 16th century, small little tiny Spain had enough both spiritual, human, and monetary resources to evangelize from the Rio Grande all the way down to Patagonia, and then add to that the Philippines, while at the same time producing such notable examples of sanctity as Teresa of Avila and Ignatius of Loyola, while at the same time being the central force, military force, combating Protestantism in Europe, all at the same time. And this has to do with the internal spiritual fervor that had already been created in the Spanish church in the 15th century. One of the things that became a factor is what is known as the Real Padronado. The Real Padronado literally translated into English as the royal patronage. Essentially, the King of Spain had virtual and absolute control over every aspect of the Catholic Church in Spain. What this meant is that the King of Spain appointed bishops, the King of Spain appointed pastors, the King of Spain confirmed religious superiors. This meant for us and for our purposes that every single missionary that came from Spain to the New World came for both a spiritual purpose and armed with a royal writ of protection and a royal writ of financing. There's a similar thing for the King of Portugal in his own land, but we'll concern ourselves with Spain at the moment. The other piece to keep in mind, and historians like to point this coincidence out,
Yes.
Spain had been overrun by the Moors of North Africa in the early part of the 8th century. The few places in the Iberian Peninsula that were not overrun by the Moors began a long-term religious crusade and religious warfare that is known in Spanish history as La Reconquista, the reconquest. And slowly but surely, they drove Islam out of the Iberian Peninsula. The very last stronghold of Muslim control in Spain, the city of Granada, fell in 1492. That very same year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. These things are deeply connected. From the point of view of the Spaniards, the internal reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, all of that energy, all of that effort simply now went to evangelizing and colonizing and conquering the New World. The final piece of this to keep in mind is we might find this very odd, but Columbus and his contemporaries, when they sailed west, they were hoping to arrive in the east. And all of a sudden, this double continent of the Americas popped up before them. They had no idea that it existed. Why do they want to sail to the east? Well, one of the reasons, of course, was trade routes. The Portuguese had already established the southernmost trade route around Africa. So trade and money was one of the issues. But the second issue, Christians had come to believe that there was a long-lost Christian kingdom far in the east that was mythically the kingdom of Prester John, John the priest. And the great big geopolitical plan was to ally Spain and the Christian forces of Europe with this Christian kingdom in the Far East, and thereby put Islam in a pincers and eliminate Islam. This is still the area of crusade. This is still where all of these things are going on. So all of these pieces fall into the background of Spain's involvement in the New World.
It's plugged in. Hang on. Your It's not moving? Not moving.
Where is it on?
Mhm.
You're going to have to manually do it.
I'll do it.
Okay. Okay, flip slide. Okay, you need to drop that. Okay, thank you. All right, briefly, 1492, Columbus founds the New World. 1515, he bumps into the islands of the Caribbean. 1521, Mexico and the start of the conquest of Mexico. 1536, Peru and the start of the conquest in South America. Essentially, Spanish colonial history is always divided up into three moments. First, exploration. We simply forget the fact that they had no idea where they were and what geography looked like. So they have to go out and explore because they have no idea what's there. Once they've explored, conquest. And then once the conquest has taken place, this is consolidated. Trace, I'm not so sure. Are the Zoom people now following us?
We can't see it.
The first round we did both at once. I don't know what's happening.
Well, you did send out the PowerPoint stuff. People could look at that because I Xeroxed off the PowerPoint thing and I've got it in front of me. You could do that. People could look at that.
Well, you were all on and now you've disappeared. Hang
The
on.
thing, you know, what you can also do, like I am fortunate, I've got an iPad and that's got, I could not bring up Zoom on the iPad, but I've got the little PowerPoint thing on there and I'm just holding my phone up
Miss?
to be my, you know, to see Father and listen to him.
Hang on, guys. We're going to get you back on.
Drop down, see what's at the bottom of this.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I've never seen this before.
Guys, I'm going to relaunch, okay?
What does that mean?
Okay, and close down everything else on your computer,
Yeah, that's all right.
because otherwise all these stupid messages are going to pop up.
Right. There we go.
Okay.
You're back.
All right. Now, because of this Real Padronado, there is this intertwining of religious and secular interests. So, if you were to ask the question, did Spain colonize the New World in order to ripen up its resources? Yes. Did Spain colonize the New World in order to conquer it? Yes. Did Spain colonize the New World in order to bring Christianity? Yes. And it's extremely difficult to separate these intertwined lines. You have to really get into the internal psychology of each and every person that came in. And certainly, you have some evidence of the conquistadores mentality, where it's just basically treat the indigenous like a mess and simply take all of their resources. And then you also have the whole other mentality of encountering a new culture, learning a new language, evangelizing, etc. And there's an intermixing and an intertwining in this. Now, we'll talk a little bit when we get into the question of the indigenous peoples on the fourth lesson. We'll talk a little bit about what was the Spanish basic predominant evangelization strategy. So I don't want to get into that now, but just at this point, we need to understand that all of these things are very deeply intertwined. When you look at it from this perspective, North America is basically an outpost. You know, as they continue to explore, North America is kind of terra incognita for them. Trace, next slide. Earliest on, the Spanish explorers touched what is today Florida. In 1513, Ponce de Leon, having heard that there is a fountain of youth in Florida went exploring. By 1565, the first permanent settlement in San Agustin, St. Augustine, Florida, was established. Florida, as you know, abuts to Georgia. Georgia is the last of the English colonies. So already there were serious border conflicts between the Spanish colonial empire and the English colonial empire. In 1763, since Spain found itself on the wrong side of the 7 Years' War, as it's known in Europe, or the French and Indian War, as it's known in North America, Spain lost Florida to Britain. In 1783, since Spain had been an ally of the American Revolution, Spain got Florida back. In 1821, Spain sold Florida to the United States. But by that point, frankly, there was precious little of any kind of evangelization or Spanish church influence left. A few place names, namely St. Augustine, and that's pretty much it. Trees. In New Mexico, they found a thriving Native American culture. So thriving was this culture and so advanced was this culture that legends came to Mexico of the legendary 7 cities of Chihuahua, 7 cities whose streets were paved with gold. The Spanish conquistador Coronado went looking for it, and Spanish missionaries and isolated Spaniards went traveling around the area. This marks the first martyr on North American soil, a Franciscan friar Juan de Padilla, in 1542. By 1595, there were Franciscan missions all through New Mexico, and enough to simply think of the major city of New Mexico, which is the city of Santa Fe, which literally translates into Spanish as the city of Holy Faith. These were all originally mission outposts in New Mexico. The combination of a certain level of the friars' paternalism against the indigenous peoples and the Spanish colonial authorities' rather rapacious, violent behavior led to the first major revolt known as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. This essentially gutted the mission system. While the friars went back, there were always tensions and a certain lack of cooperation between the indigenous peoples and the friars and the Spanish authorities, such that when in 1846, this area was taken after the Mexican War as part of the United States, there was again very, very little church infrastructure left. A few old mission remnants were around, but that's pretty much it. Trees. Also in the Southwest, the Jesuit missionary Eusebio Cano in 1687 was one of these explorers who adopted a particularly positive attitude towards the indigenous people. It is Cano, for example, who learns the languages and actually creates alphabets for these indigenous languages. Fairly rare among the Spanish missionaries. Beginning in 1659, the Spanish authorities crossed the Rio Grande into what we would call Tejas, Texas today. And essentially, this was a geopolitical counter move. As we'll see in a few minutes, the French had been moving down the Mississippi River to found Caniabri's home areas in Louisiana, and the Spanish were a little leery of having a competing power that close. So they drove over the Rio Grande in order to counter this increasing French influence. In 1718, they founded the Mission of San Antonio, which eventually became the city of San Antonio. The Alamo was the first of the missions, followed very closely by San Fernando. San Fernando is now the Cathedral Church of the Archdiocese of San Antonio, and it calls itself the oldest cathedral in the United States because the church building predates the cathedral in Baltimore. The first erected cathedral is the Cathedral of the Assumption in Baltimore, which we'll talk about next week. This area of Texas and Arizona was, together with what happened in New Mexico, the missions were secularized in the 1790s. 1790s is when Napoleon had conquered much of Spain, and much of the Spanish colonial government was relatively anti-clerical and Freemason. Therefore, they took the opportunity of secularizing the missions, in other words, kicking the friars out, much like they had suppressed the Jesuits in the 1770s, and they expropriated all the land and turned it into colonial centers. That's pretty much the way it remained until Mexico declared its independence in 1810. And then when Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1838, the same things happened. And finally, they become part of the United States in 1845. It's an interesting side note. My own branch of the Franciscans bought one of these missions in the 1850s as our attempt to reclaim this. We simply could not sustain it and wound up selling that mission in order to finance our move into Syracuse, New York. Part of our own internal history. A little bit colorful when it gets there at that point. So in all of these, our last one is California. California is essentially the last gasp of the Spanish colonial empire. The King of Spain, having heard that the Tsar of Russia had crossed the Bering Strait and had claimed Alaska, of course having no sense of geography and distance, was concerned that the Russians would come down and threaten Mexico from the north. Therefore, he decided to counter that by sending up missionaries and colonization all along the upper California coast. And the name most associated with this is San Junipero Serra, who founded the mission in San Diego in 1769, the first of 21 missions all along what became known as El Camino Real, the Royal Way. Now, one could say that the Royal Way was the Royal Way of Carlos III of Spain, or one could say it was the Royal Way of Jesus Christ, King of the universe, and both would actually be correct. Again, we will enter into a discussion in a couple of weeks on the controversial figure of Junipero Serra, particularly in our kind of erased culture of today, where we're looking back at historical figures. Serra is considered to be the founder of the state of California. These 21 missions, of course, are part of why the major cities of California all have saints' names. So, for example, there is the city of Nuestra Señora de la Porciúncula de Los Angeles, Our Lady of the Little Portion of the Angels, which is known, of course, as Los Angeles. That's its official name. It was another mission. each of these missions was precisely 1 day's walk from another. And they were designed that way. Sarah walked 1 day north from Lower California into Upper California and founded San Diego. When that was done, he walked 1 day's north and founded Los Angeles. And 1 day's north, et cetera, until he reached San Francisco de Asís, in, of course, modern-day San Francisco. So this allowed the mission superior and easy access. He could make an entire journey in 3 weeks if he had to do it, and up and down and connect. This becomes the nucleus and the basis for the colonization of California. However, honestly speaking, Upper California was always considered a backwater of Lower California. It was the place where adventurers would go. It was the place where people thought they could find kind of easy money. And frankly, it was also the place where a lot of outlaws and desperados skipped away from Mexican authority into a place that seemed somewhat looser. In 1833, these missions are secularized by the Mexican government again. And in 1850, they come under American control. Now, since these missions are somewhat more recent than the other ones, virtually all of these are still in use, and almost all of them have come back under church control. The vast majority of them are actually functioning churches and parishes within the various dioceses of California. Okay? Let's stop there. And are there any questions? We'll take questions from the audience first and then Zoom questions. How's that? Connie.
You did not mention the Spanish Inquisition. Did that have any impact?
Okay. Question is the Spanish Inquisition. Yes, the Spanish Inquisition was actually not an arm of the Catholic Church. It was an arm of the royal power of Spain. And the Spanish Inquisition was essentially set up for one particular reason. That is, in the Middle Ages, Spain was the most religiously pluralistic of any country in Europe. It had a sizable portion of Catholic Christians, it had a sizable portion of Muslims, and it had a sizable portion of Jews. As the Reconquista continued in the 1490s, the Spanish kings forced all Muslims and Jews to either convert to Catholicism or forcibly emigrate. After 1 or 2 generations, there was a great suspicion that some of these new Christians, as they were called, did not convert willingly, fully, completely, and wholly. In other words, they were secret Jews or secret Muslims. Therefore, the task of the Spanish Inquisition was to find them and root them out. As an arm of the Spanish state, the Inquisition was brought to the New World as well. And the New World had its standing inquisitors in the various regions of the Spanish Empire. When the Inquisition was abolished in the early part of the 19th century in Spain, the Inquisition was abolished in the same way in Spanish colonial America. An interesting story, if I may. I may have told the story before, but it's a good one and it bears repeating. There's an American Catholic Church historian from New Mexico, Langdon, who wrote an article that he watched the movie Schindler's List. Do you recall in Schindler's List, the closing scene is all of the Schindler survivors walking past Schindler's grave and leaving a stone on top of the memorial epitaph. And this church historian stopped and said, my family does that. And then he went back and looked, and he realized that his family were the quote-unquote 15th century New Christians that escaped from persecution in Spain, found some persecution in Mexico, and they came up into New Mexico, and there they lived, but they maintained this Jewish practice for 500 years. Which is kind of a fascinating story in and of itself. Another question? Yes.
The missionaries were primarily Franciscans. You mentioned one Jesuit.
Primarily Franciscans and Jesuits, primarily. Although every major religious order, Benedictines, Trinitarians, Carmelites, Mercedarians, Augustinians, everybody sent missionaries over. But when we're talking about the missionaries who kind of like went out into the boonies, it's primarily Franciscan friars and Jesuits. Any Zoom questions? Tracy, you want to moderate that?
Yes. Any questions? From any of our Zoom attendees? No?
Okay. Moving on.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, and maybe this is not, is sort of a non sequitur at this point in our history, but, you know, I look back to, you know, slavery in this country and the way it was practiced and how I think, oh my gosh, how could I have ever participated in that? And I look back as a Catholic at how they treated Native Americans, whether it was because of church or because of state. Were there missionaries who, and I think maybe Father Sierra was one, maybe I read somewhere, were there missionaries who said, you know, it's really appalling the way we treat these people. They have a culture and it is a vibrant culture and, you know, that kind of thing.
Okay. The basic question is, were there missionaries who acted more on a gospel impulse than on that of a conquest or an economic impulse? And the answer is yes. We will treat this more in detail in the fourth week. But essentially, the patron of this, please keep in mind that there was an ecclesiastical debate at the University of Salamanca in the 1490s, in which it was seriously posed as a question whether the indigenous people of the New World had souls. Because of course, if they had souls, then they could be baptized, and therefore they needed to be treated with a certain level of human rights. If they did not have souls, they were just exceptionally intelligent and well-trainable farm animals. Now that was a debate on the highest level of theology. The champion in the earliest years in Latin America is Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Dominican missionary and bishop in, I believe, Mexico, was one of the signal defenders of Indian rights and Indian dignity. But again, once more, we'll treat this question in the fourth week. It's a much more complicated question. Okay, let's pass over the Pyrenees from Spain into France. If Spain had its golden age in the 16th century, France was not so lucky. France underwent 7 religious wars within the boundaries of France. Essentially, the reform of John Calvin found great roots in areas of France. And there was a large battle between the Catholic, quote unquote, devout party, unquote, and what was known as the Huguenot Party, which finally only ended in 1589, during which, by a quirk of history, the Calvinist king of Navarre, Henry IV, acceded to the throne of France. And after more bitter civil war, this Protestant king of France decided to become Catholic. He is supposed to have quipped to his advisors, the price of Paris is worth sitting at a mass. That ended religious warfare in France. That also means that the French church did not begin any of its own internal renewal and reform until 20 or 30 years after the Council of Trent. But what this led to was a huge moment of Catholic life in France in the 17th century. So here at the level of spirituality, we might cite Cardinal de Bérulle, and the founder of what is known as the French school, Jean-Jacques Ollier, the founder of modern seminary systems, St. Vincent de Paul, and St. Jean-Marie de Marillac, the founders essentially of the Catholic charitable endeavors. These are all French, all of the same period, all of whom essentially interacted with one another. So what happened in Spain in the 16th century happened also in France in the 17th century. Now, notwithstanding the religious warfare, France early got into the colonial exploration realm. In 1524, they sent Verrazano to explore the coast of North America. He found the Narrows that are still named for him today outside of New York. In 1534, Jacques Cartier discovered the St. Lawrence River, which they thought was the Northwest Passage. That is a short way to make it still from France to China. They didn't realize, of course, that ended at the Great Lakes, but this becomes the entryway. Along the St. Lawrence, Champlain founds the city of Quebec in 1608 and Montreal in 1611. And these, of course, still become the center of Quebecois French culture in Canada. Trees? Now, from this base along the St. Lawrence, French missionaries enter into what is present-day Maine from 1615. And much like the arguments between Alaska and Mexico and Louisiana and Texas and Georgia and Florida, there's an argument: does Maine belong to New France or does it belong to New England? We're all aware, of course, that rivers are somewhat artificial boundaries, much like the Rio Grande in the south is an artificial boundary. Franciscan, Capuchin, and Jesuit missionaries worked with the indigenous peoples all in this area. This is one of the areas, one of the few, in which early evangelization activities took very, very deep root. The native peoples, the Abenaki and the Penobscots, embraced Catholicism sincerely and fiercely. Already in the middle part of the 17th century. In the 1790s, there is in the archives of the United States government a letter from the chief of the Abenakis addressed to King George Washington, asking the king to send us a faithful Catholic priest because there hasn't been one here for 20 years. Of course, because the Abenaki chief would know that it was the great white fathers who came at the behest of the king of France. Well, the king changed, so King George Washington will now send us this priest. Okay? But it's an evidence of the deep connection that was made with Catholicism. The missionary Sebastian Rail in 1694 was perhaps a tad bit aggressive in Maine, as he and his Native American compatriots were kind of pushing along the borders between New England and New France. There was an ugly massacre in Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704, which really kind of soured New England strongly against any kind of French influence, but as well strongly against any kind of Catholic influence. And the two very much go together. Trees? From upstate New York, along Lake Champlain, and then down the Hudson River again, French missionaries enter in. Most famously, these are the Jesuit martyrs at Auriesville, New York, St. Isaac Jogues and his companions. These French missionaries were quite intrepid and full of vim and vigor. A little story from the life of Isaac Jogues. Isaac Jogues had been captured by the Iroquois, the allies of the English, and they knew enough about Catholicism that they understood that all of his priestly power came from the two fingers with which he held a little white wafer. So they chopped off his thumb and his forefinger, so he could no longer confect the Eucharist. He recovered, he went back to Europe, got a special dispensation from the Pope to confect the Eucharist with these two fingers, and then came back to evangelize again. And at this point, the Iroquois said, enough with this one. But that's the level of intensity that these French missionaries brought. If you'd like to get a feel of this, there's a movie that came out approximately 20 or 30 years ago entitled Black Robe. And Black Robe is drawn directly from what were called the Jesuit relations. That is, all Jesuit missionaries were required to send a monthly letter back to the general in Rome describing what they were doing. And the whole movie, Black Robe, is drawn precisely from these Jesuit relations. And you get the feeling of the intensity of all of this. And it's actually quite a well-done movie in and of itself. Along in the upstate New York area, the Huron people essentially sided with the French, while their enemies, the Iroquois, sided with the English. And therefore, the indigenous peoples became proxy warfare in the battles between England and France over control of upstate New York and the Hudson River Valley. Saint Kateri Tekakwitha was a member of the Huron tribe, the Huron Confederation, the Lily of the Mohawks, as she was called, and her shrine is still in Fonda, New York, and her shrine is actually under the care of our friars. In the 1930s, we had an amateur archaeologist who discovered the remains of an indigenous settlement there. And with some historical corroboration, although not universal, this village is understood to be the village of Kateri Tekakwitha. So her shrine is located there. It's very close to the Jesuit-run shrine in Auriesville of the Jesuit martyrs. New York, in the earliest period, was controlled by the Netherlands and known as New Holland. In 1664, the Dutch were expelled and the English entered in. And in 1688, in what is known as the Glorious Revolution, in which a dynastic change in England prevented a pro-Catholic English monarch of the House of Stuart from acceding to the throne, renewed anti-Catholic feeling expelled all of the French missionaries from upstate New York. Trees? Again, all along, anywhere where there is water, these French missionaries went. So anyway, in the great water systems of North America, the Hudson, the St. Lawrence, Lake Champlain, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi Valley, any of these areas were all fertile grounds for French missionaries. They finally reached the upper Mississippi in what we would call Illinois today, where there were thriving French missions there during the American Revolution. Now, these areas were all extremely thinly populated. Essentially, the French were most interested in trapping beaver fur because beaver hats and beaver coats were the rage in Europe. So they could make a lot of money, cheap and fast, by trapping beaver. They weren't much interested in anything else, and therefore, what you really have in this area of the waterways is just a lot of old French names with very little else of French influence. Most particularly, you have Detroit, Dubuque, and Sault-Saint-Marie. These are all just Frenchified names indicating there was an earlier French presence, but there's very little left. The one place where there was significant French presence is trees, Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. Again, Louisiana is the end of the Mississippi, and the Gulf Coast, of course, connects them to parts of the Spanish Empire. The French founded the city of Biloxi in 1699, Mobile, Alabama in 1702, and New Orleans, 1718. Now, this is the most dense area of French settlements. This is the area that is still somewhat Francophone in its patois, certainly Francophone in its legislation, because the state of Louisiana is the only place that does not have English common law, but has the Napoleonic Code still as part of its state's laws. When you look at New Orleans, you get a feel for the ecclesiastical culture of French Canada, in which the French crown simply established religious houses like the old Ursulines in New Orleans, established St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, established all of these areas. Again, to give you some idea, I mentioned that Montreal was founded early in the 17th century. The French government gave the entire city of Montreal to the French Sulpicians. so that the French Sulpicians could enact feudal tithing and taxes in order to support the first seminary in the New World, which is the Grand Seminaire of Montreal. And the French remained feudal lords, the French Sulpicians. In English, the Sulpicians titled themselves the Gentlemen of Saint-Sulpice. The more accurate translation is Les Seigneurs de Saint-Sulpice, the Lords of Saint-Sulpice. I worked under them for 16 years. I know what I speak. But the French Sulpicians controlled the entire city of Montreal as its feudal master until the English period in 1763. Again, that same kind of feudal, tithing, church and state intertwinement occurred all in New Orleans as well. The culture of Louisiana shifted a bit when in 1775, the British expelled from a part of French-speaking Canada all of the French natives, who were known as Acadians. When they get to Louisiana, they become Cajuns. And Cajun culture is somewhat interesting. First of all, Cajun culture is not completely Catholic, because there are a significant number of Huguenot French Cajuns in New Orleans and in the area. Secondly, the high-class French culture is usually known as Creole, and that will be pretty citified, pretty urban. The Cajun culture is a little bit more backwoods, swamp, small town. So we who are not from that area kind of distinguish New Orleans as all of this, but one kind of separates. There is a big difference between Creole cooking, Creole kitchen, Creole culture, and Cajun cooking, Cajun kitchen, and Cajun culture. The particular mix of New Orleans is even more particular because in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Spain controlled New Orleans. So in addition to this Creole and Cajun culture, there is now a Spanish culture put on top of it. Finally, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, and all of this very French and very Catholic thing came under the control of North American Yankees. Comments or questions? Connie, this is your home territory. Did I do it justice?
You did a good job.
Okay. Questions? Let's go from Zoom first. Any questions?
No, just a comment, but it took us 20 years and we found out that my husband's family was related to the Acadians that were thrown out of Nova Scotia. And we found when we went back where they have the monument to Evangeline,
Yep.
we were finally able to find out that the name there was written down, Andre Dupuis, and all his cattle and his family and everything that was thrown out. But it took us 20 years, but we
Yep.
found it out. It was amazing.
Friar Tim, my grandfather was baptized in St. Louis Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, we think, Cajun, but it wasn't a cool thing to be Cajun.
Nope.
His surname was Wilson, which was an English name, but I asked him once when I was very little where he came from. He said, well, his people were from France.
Yeah. It's entirely possible that they adopted an anglicized name.
I see.
Okay, in order to conform a little bit better, and especially if there was a good amount of prejudice against Cajuns, who were for the most part considered kind of backwater hillbillies at the time.
Right, right.
you would have done better with an anglicized name than a purely French one.
But no question about it, very Catholic.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
One
That
other,
tracks.
John?
yeah, one other thread to bring into New Orleans is the one from Haiti.
Yes.
Haiti was the most important province of France because of its production of sugar.
Correct.
And then, of course, there's the Haitian Revolution, and a serious number of French and slaves and free Haitians end up in New Orleans. So that becomes one of the threads there.
Yeah.
In addition, and you started with it early with the Spanish, but it's the Spanish and the Portuguese who bring over the plantation economy, which they had bumped into an Eastern Mediterranean from the Arabs and the whole production of sugar on sugar.
Correct. That we'll get to in the fourth week.
Okay, and there's one other thread here, and that you mentioned it with the exclusion of the Jews and the Muslims, and it's at that point in Spanish culture that the sangre pura,
Exactly.
the whole thread of a race, a superiority of race that is can be traced in an aspect of Catholicism, because it's in the baptismal books that one finds the families and their accurate records of who they are and how truly Spanish, quote unquote. I mean, the whole ideas of these ethnic purity in spite of the blending that goes on in society. But those are all threads that I think they're important in all of this. It's not just European and indigenous, even from the get-go.
And a piece on that, John, for those of you who may have had difficulty hearing it, several pieces about the influence of Haiti on New Orleans as well, and the question of the expulsion of the Jews and the Moors from Spain created a certain mentality of pure blood. This mentality of pure blood is very strong in Latin American culture, because Latin American culture, particularly in terms of its ecclesiastical pieces of it, Latin American culture did not readily allow native people, even Spaniards born in the New World, to become priests and or bishops. Because of course, sangre puro, pure blood, had to be maintained. And you did not ever want the possibility of some pure blood Spanish lady having to kneel down and confess at the feet of a dirty mestizo priest in some church. Consequently, the whole question of race and pure blood is one of the dirty little secrets in Latin America. When I taught in the seminary, I had a number of Colombian students, and I would always invite them to go on the website and look for a picture of the Colombian Episcopal Conference and ask themselves, from looking at these faces, could all of these faces come right from Spain itself? And the answer, of course, is yes. In Latin America, the darker one's skin, the less likely one would ever be admitted into seminary. So, John, all your stuff is abundantly, but unfortunately, played out in ecclesiastical history. Questions from here? Connie.
Something interesting about French in southern Louisiana is that that part of the world is southward looking, and in the developing history of the church and the people too, they were looking much more to the Caribbean
Certainly.
than to America.
Where was all their trade?
Yeah.
Yeah, the trade was all North American trade. All of the coal, all of the iron, all of the wheat, all of the corn that came down in barges in the Mississippi, where did it wind up? Going out the Gulf of Mexico, either to Latin America or over to Europe. So their point of view was always in that direction. They were not particularly interested.
The governor of Louisiana under the Spanish he lived in Havana.
Yeah, as was the Bishop of Havana was actually the ecclesiastical superior in New Orleans up until 1803, when it shifted from the Archbishop of Havana to the Archbishop of Baltimore. Can you imagine? Okay, now we get to the one that's probably closest to home to us, the English colonial situation. First of all, we need to backtrack into the complicated pieces of English religious history, beginning with Henry VIII. Henry VIII, theologically, was an Anglo-Catholic. That is, he rejected papal authority, but for the most part was quite convinced Catholic. When he died, his son Edward VI, who was young and sickly, fell under much more Protestant advisors. And the English church shifted much more in the direction of Protestantism. When he died, he was succeeded by his half-sister, Mary, who was a devout Catholic, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And she attempted to shift the church much more back into a Roman Catholic point of view. When she died, her half-sister Elizabeth acceded to the throne, and Elizabeth essentially developed a polity that is not quite Protestant and not quite Catholic. The quote-unquote middle way. So, for example, when you read in the Second Vatican Council, the documents that speak of ecumenism, they speak about the Protestant Reformation, and then the last line is, the Church of England is a special case. Because it is actually a very special case. It doesn't fit, excuse me, easily into either a Catholic or a Protestant realm. From that perspective as well, the Church of England has a very broad tent in which coexist more or less easily, not so much easily anymore after the Anglican Church adopted the ordination of women, then the ordination of women bishops, and now a more acceptance of homosexuality. The big tent of Anglicanism is beginning to come asunder. But Anglicanism, in theory, has extremely theologically conservative prelates on one end and extremely theologically liberal prelates on another end. They find it very difficult to agree upon anything. That's the case. Now, where it falls into colonialism, there was always some element of Catholic practice that remained. If you want to get a graphic picture of this, I advise you to read Stripping the Altars by Eamon Duffy, which mines the parish register of one church in England and plays out how all of these religious changes came across it. That one text, Stripping the Altars, is the single biggest defense against the old and traditional Protestant notion that everyone was happy to be rid of Roman Catholicism, which is simply not true. Now, this small rump of English Catholics got into more trouble in 1570 when Pope St. Pius V formally excommunicated Queen Elizabeth. Now, Queen Elizabeth, from one point of view, couldn't care less. She could consider herself a Catholic anyway. But the popes had refrained from excommunicating any of the English monarchs with the hope of drawing them back. The effect of this, of course, was that Elizabeth had no intention of being drawn back, and this then meant that every believing Catholic in England could also be accused of being disloyal to the crown. So it opened up much more of a wellspring of anti-Catholic feeling. In 1570, as part of the excommunication, Pope St. Pius invited the Catholic monarchs of Europe to invade England and restore Catholicism. The result of that was the Spanish Armada in 1588. Again, not a happy thing to be a Catholic in the wake of the Spanish Armada. In 1603, a group of young idealistic Catholics decided that the best way to reestablish Catholicism was to wait for the solemn opening of Parliament, in which the Queen and all the Anglican bishops and the House of Lords and all of the Anglican gentry would be present, and to plant kegs of gunpowder in the basement and blow up the House of Parliament, and thereby reestablish Catholicism. This is still commemorated in some English villages as Guy Fawkes Day, in which the popular thing is to burn in effigy a figure representing the Pope. As a result of all of this, Catholicism is completely marginalized. Marginalized Catholicism among the wealthy and the landed gentry, it was somewhat tolerated because, of course, they had money, power, and influence. And some of these gentry, this generic term is called recusant. Some of these gentry were publicly Anglican and privately Catholic. Others were publicly Catholic as well. And there's a whole body of historical literature and historical research around recusant Catholicism. Patrice? One of these recusant families, the Calvins, were ennobled as the first Baron of Baltimore. Baltimore is a fishing village in Ireland. The first Baron of Baltimore, George Calvert, received permission to found a colony in the New World. Trees? On March 25th, 1634, Calvert's colonial expedition landed at St. Clement's Island in the Chesapeake Bay in what became the colony of Maryland. Now, the very name itself should tip you off. While it was officially named the land of Henrietta Maria, the Catholic Queen of England, it's always understood that this was to Mary land. And of course, it's on the Feast of the Incarnation would double that down. Now, this expedition that came was not exclusively of Catholics, nor was it a majority of Catholics. There were, however, a sizable plurality of Catholics among these colonists. And their hope was to found a colony where Catholicism could be practiced more openly. They were accompanied by three quote-unquote Jesuit gentlemen. Jesuit gentlemen means they were people of means, they were not laborers. The fact that they were Jesuit gentlemen tips you off that they were not the official chaplains of this. There could be no official Catholic chaplain, but they were recognized as both Jesuits and as gentlemen. In 1649, the Assembly of Maryland passed the first act of religious toleration in the Western world. The act concerning religion. which granted toleration to anyone who professed belief in the Trinity and professed belief in the divinity of Christ. This, of course, excluded Jews, excluded Islam, excluded indigenous religions, but any Christian religion other than Unitarianism would be free and welcome to practice and found itself in Maryland. That lasted for only 40 years. As part of the Glorious Revolution, the rights of Catholics were restricted in Maryland in 1689, and Catholics were as marginalized there as they were back in England. In 1707, the Maryland Assembly allowed a certain toleration of Catholic private worship. Now let's take a look at what that looked like. First of all, it was aristocratic. Essentially, only people who had large enough houses could afford to turn a wing of their house into a private chapel. So Maryland Catholicism was aristocratic. It was very manorial, plantations. One had to have a lot of money in order to support all of this. And it was private. Interestingly, the state sport of Maryland is jousting. Why? Because these various manors would get together on Sundays and joust for the brass ring. It was the aristocratic sport of these manorial families in Maryland. Now, among the Catholics, because they were marginalized and they were second-class citizen, apostasy was quite common. The Calverts themselves formally abandoned Catholicism in 1715. Again, if you want to go along to get along, you abandon Catholicism, quite simply speaking. They sent their sons and their daughters to private education in France, their sons to Jesuit colleges, their daughters to Ursuline academies. Because of this, Catholicism was viewed as being an enemy interlude. It was way too French, and therefore way too enemy. There was a huge amount of popular prejudice and legal discrimination against Catholics. Therefore, piety was very domestic, interior, personal, and non-denominational. No one talked about adoring the Blessed Sacrament or saying the Rosary or praying for the Pope. The famous example of colonial pious literature is Richard Challoner's Garden of the Soul, published in 1774, which could be read by prophet either by an Anglican or a Catholic, and no one would know the difference. That's the level at which we find ourselves. Trace? There were perhaps 50 house or private chapels in Maryland. I had the privilege of saying Mass in one of them. The ancestral home of the Carroll family is Doggeregan Manor, found in Howard County, Maryland, very near to our friary in Ellicott City. And up until the 1990s, the Carroll family allowed one Sunday Mass to be open to the public. So every 4 weeks or so would be the turn of the friars to go and say Mass in the private manor chapel at Doggeregan Manor, which was like, frankly, walking back into the 18th century. Just a timepiece. These churches, very sparsely decorated, very infrequently served. There were few priests, and they came around on horseback every several weeks. When they came on horseback, they would arrive on a Sunday, and people started gathering at dawn. The first thing the priest did was sit down, put on his purple stole, and hear confessions. And he heard confessions for several hours until lunch came, because he had to say Mass before lunch in the old rubrics. So Mass was said at the very latter part of the morning, followed by a common meal. Then in the afternoon, they would regather for a Vesper service, at which there would be a sermon, hymns, litanies, and catechesis style. There is as much vernacular as possible. They used Latin only where they absolutely needed to use Latin. The traveling priests insisted on Eucharist at least yearly. At least yearly, because some of these stations could only be visited yearly. On Sundays, people basically said the same prayer we say each Sunday during the 11 o'clock Mass, or some version of it, of spiritual communion. And pious people would leave themselves together. Very commonly, sisters who intermarried into other families would agree that 12 o'clock each day or 3 o'clock each afternoon, both connected to the Passion of Christ, that they would gather and do an act of spiritual communion, both with the Eucharist they could not receive and with one another since they could not be present. It was impossible to keep the feast regulations. In Europe, feasts, which would mean one day a month in honor of the apostles, plus all the solemnities of the church, were days in which people could not work. In a minority population, it made no sense to force people to take days off, in which case people would lose money. The same thing would go with fasting regulations. All of these were loosened up. Because again, in frontier conditions, you can't adhere to the letter of the law. Generally, they deferred baptism until a priest could show up. If the infant was in danger of death, a layperson would baptize, which has always been a part of Catholic canon law. But they generally tried to defer and wait for the priest to come. Marriages were always celebrated before a priest. People simply waited until Father showed up. The church was incredibly strict regarding mixed marriages. And it was clearly understood that the best way to keep a minority religion alive was to make sure that your daughter married a Catholic or your son married a Catholic. Now, because there were so few Catholics and so few Catholics of the proper class of gentry, canon law regarding consanguinity, that is, not marrying your second cousin or your first cousin, these laws were all dispensed with and relaxed in part of the greater good of keeping people Catholic. This is why, when you do today ancestry investigation in these old Catholic families in Maryland and their descendants in Kentucky around Bardstown and Louisville, it's a nightmare because people marry their cousins and everything is all intertwined. So it's incredibly difficult. But this is the way in which the church managed to keep the faith alive. Obviously, extreme-unction could only be administered in the presence of a priest. If a priest was not present and someone was dying, the head of the family would say the appropriate prayers, especially if he could read and understand Latin. Same thing goes with a funeral. Obviously, if a priest is there, the funeral is conducted by a priest. If the priest is not coming around for several months and there is no embalming, you do a funeral by the head of the household. Same way. Two sacraments two sacraments were never celebrated in colonial England: confirmation and ordination, because there were no bishops. The few Catholics in the United States were subject to the Vicar Apostolic of London, a missionary bishop in London. And of course, he would never translate, go across the Atlantic for any reason whatsoever. Whatever priests were there were priests sent by the Vicar Apostolic of London to minister to these scattered populations. Colonial Catholicism elsewhere. In 1672, the Duke of York in England converts to Catholicism. This is the House of Stuart again. Since he was the titular lord of New York, Catholicism began to make some gains in New York with Irish settlers coming over. This ends in 1689, once again, with the Glorious Revolution, which is one of these major things in all of this. In 1682, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania also allows free worship. The Catholics were restricted until 1705, where they were disenfranchised. In 1705, Old St. Joseph's in Philadelphia, which is still a functioning Jesuit parish in downtown colonial Philadelphia, was founded as a public chapel. And it essentially was the only public house of worship in the 13 public Catholic house of worship in the 13 colonies. There were scattered Catholics in Virginia and elsewhere, and it's estimated that at the time of the American Revolution, there were 25,000 Catholics in British North America, and they were served by, at the beginning of the Revolution, 21 priests. At the end of the Revolution, that number had dwindled to 14. And at the end of the Revolution, the British Vicar Apostolic says, "You're your own country. I ain't your bishop anymore. Find your priests someplace else," which we'll touch upon next week. Trees, could you flip to the next one? There you go. I'm making you run around tonight, Trees. There you go. The very last section for English colonial Catholicism. When the French lost the 7 Years' War in 1763, and Quebec became a British colony, the Brits didn't want to foment trouble in Canada. So they tended to give lots of concessions to French Canada. However, the Brits were not willing to allow their revenues to drop, so they increased taxation on their 13 Atlantic colonies to offset their losses in Canada. So therefore, taxation and religion become intertwined in another anti-French element. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, writing under the pseudonym of First Citizen, begins a long pamphlet war asking for Catholic toleration. He was probably the wealthiest man in the colonies at the time, and as the wealthiest man in the colonies, and certainly the wealthiest man in Maryland, he had no right to vote because he was a Catholic. And he simply pressed for the enlightened issue to be allowed some civil rights. Now, when the revolution came, it's estimated that a majority of American Catholics probably supported the revolution. Difficult to know because Pew Research wasn't around to do a poll at the time. But the general consensus is that most Catholics understood that if we get rid of the British crown, it can't possibly be any worse. And we stand some chance of some religious liberty with freedom. So most of these 25 Catholics were kind of patriots as opposed to loyalists, although we really don't know too much how close that was. Charles Carroll of Carrollton's nephew, the Jesuit priest, Father John Carroll, was named as an ambassador, an unofficial ambassador of the Continental Congress to go to Canada with 2 other American commissioners to try to convince the Canadians to join us in revolt. Very astutely, the Continental Congress understood that sending a Catholic priest to represent you would get you on the good side of the French-Canadian Catholics. However, the French-Canadian Catholics looking around and said, well, the Brits treat us pretty well. And down there, they're still burning Guy Fawkes. You know, they're still burning effigies of the Pope, and there's all this anti-Catholic. Why would we join them? The devil you know is definitely better than the devil you don't know. And the French Canadians simply decided, no thank you, which explains the American law. So, again, at the end of the Revolution, approximately 25,000 Catholics, mostly in Maryland, some in Pennsylvania, New York, some of what would be in the later Northwest Territories of Illinois, and then the remnants of the missions in Florida, and the thriving French culture along the Gulf of Mexico. And we'll end there and pick up next week with being American and Catholic. But let's start. Any final questions? We'll start with the indoor crowd. Any questions from my in-live person attendees?
I've got a question.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Is Connie Cajun or Creole?
I'm not either,
No.
because I'm immigrant.
From where?
Exactly where, Ireland, Germany, and Italy.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yes.
There we go.
So back with these private chapels in Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
you know, very well, you know, richer people. Were any, presumably, this was Maryland, presumably this was a slave state at the time. And do we have any idea if any of these people who were Catholic at the time and had their little beautiful chapels, sparsely decorated though they were, do we have any sense whether any of them, how they participated in slavery or if they rejected it?
Okay, the question is slavery among the aristocratic class in Maryland. Again, we'll touch on this on the 4th week.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that.
Very briefly, it is an indisputable fact that every Catholic institution south of the Mason-Dixon line owned slaves. It is an indisputable fact, including the Jesuit gentlemen. They owned slaves, period. It's an indisputable fact. The Basilica of Baltimore was built by slave labor, as was the White House and the Capitol. They were built by slave labor, period. Indisputable fact. We'll touch on why the point of theology in slavery, how it intersected and what it looked like in the United States in the 19th century.
Thank you.
And one thing, oops, my mic functioning, yeah, O'Sullivan here. But the French connection is very interesting. You left it kind of as a connection of the cultured folks in Maryland. And as we think of the educational drive and leaders of what would become a beginning of an educated Catholicism, goes back to France. We've got Thomas Jefferson, who's deeply a Francophile. And then we've got the absolute essential role of the French Navy in defeating the British at Yorktown. So the trend is with a bit of wind in the sail for La France.
Right. The question is the importance of France in this period. Please keep in mind that in the 18th century, France was the leading power of Europe. French culture was considered the highest class in Europe. French fashion, French cuisine, French diplomacy. France was the pinnacle of power in 18th century Europe, which of course is the background of the rivalry between France and Great Britain. Now, one of the reasons why the French were so hospitable to the English Catholic recusants and the oppressed Irish peasantry in Ireland, everything that you do to help a Catholic in Britain and Ireland manages to twist the tail of the English lion one more time. So while there was clear religious sentiment, there was also a geopolitical motive. And all of these things intertwine in this period. Any other Zoom questions?
Friar Tim, there are, in my experience, African American communities that are Catholic and kind of an aristocratic background in Northwest Washington and around the DC suburbs. Is there any connection between that group of that community and these early Maryland settlers?
Okay, the question is the somewhat affluent Black Catholic settlements in places like Washington and Baltimore. I would also add New Orleans and St. Louis as the principal areas where this all would take place. What connection is there with this earlier colonial stuff? Again, as we'll talk about in the fourth week, everybody's interested in this topic, which is why I'm glad I picked it and devoting a whole time for it. Catholic slave owners were enjoined to baptize their slaves. So some of these can trace their Catholicism back to Catholic slave time. Okay? Others of these are descendants of what John O'Sullivan was talking about, the Haitian connection, that many Haitians of color and the boundary of color, whether one is a mulatto, whether one is a quadroon or an octoroon, to use very antique but precise language, that is a quadroon. One of my grandparents was Black. An octoroon, one of my great-grandparents was Black. These are legal descriptions. Some of these come from the Haitian immigrants that left the slave rebellions in Haiti and settled in these areas. The most prominent one is the founder of the first African-American women's religious community, Mother Mary Lange, or known as, in English as Mother Mary Lang, but Mother Mary Lange in Baltimore, of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Some others of these affluent Catholic communities in those cities that I mentioned, in the post-war period, there was a tremendous effort on the part of urban Catholic parishes to reach out to African Americans, and they did this mainly by opening their schools for parochial education. Sometimes free and scholarship, other times by the parents scraping nickels and dimes to pay the tuition. Many of these young men and women who went through Catholic primary and then Catholic high school education converted to Catholicism. And because their educational opportunities were much superior to the urban public schools that they left behind, they tended to rise more in the socioeconomic status. So many of them are either children of converts or converts themselves due to the Catholic educational system in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it's a combination of all of these things, Pete.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. See you next Monday, same time, same place.
Thank you, Friar Tim.
Tuesday? Monday.
It's next Tuesday.
I'm sorry, next Tuesday.
Next
Today's
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Hey, John, can you stay on for just a moment? I'm going to check the sound system real quick. And thank you all. Hey, Jim.
Thank
Talk to
you,
tonight.
Chief.
Bye, guys. Thank you. Hey, Tom. There's the Kavanaughs.
No, I did not. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you for being here, guys.
Thank you.
I so appreciate it. My head's swimming.
Well,
Reese,
Hello.
is that John?
I'm going to
Kavanaugh?
check my sound. If you can stay on, John and Chris, for just a moment.
Sure.
There's something, I just want to check my settings real quick.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Hang on.
yeah. Well, I don't get into the particular local tribes as much as the general attitude of what this is all about. You know, essentially the general evangelization and frankly, racial attitudes around all of these things, which is not a happy chapter in Catholic history. Not a happy chapter. And I'm thankful for the nice words of the actual people.
Oh, wow, it was wonderful. I feel really good. I just wish we could have.
Thank you, guys. Can you
Sure.
just
Have a good one,
stay,
Chris.
stay,
Setting up the PowerPoints ahead of time, that made it easier for us.
what was that?
Thanks for setting the PowerPoints.
Oh. Thank you for your suggestion.
Sure.
Bye, guys.
We'll see ya.